When he walked into the bathroom, I was in the middle of taking a shower, completely lost in the comforting routine that had become my sanctuary. It was a moment that marked the start of something both forbidden and overwhelming in its intensity. The steam filled the small room, thick and heavy, like a dense curtain wrapping me in a cocoon that shielded me from the outside world. Ever since the divorce, my mornings had turned into sacred rituals, a time for me to find solace. Long, indulgent showers had become my escape, the water washing away the stress, the loneliness, and the sharp sting of starting over at 38. Soft music played in the background, low enough to feel like a gentle hum, blending with the sound of the water cascading down my skin. I was completely absorbed in my own world, unaware of the door opening. I didn't hear the faint creak as it shifted or the soft, almost silent footsteps crossing the tiled floor. It wasn't until I heard a muffled gasp, a sound so delicate it nearly drowned in the steady spray of water, that I realized I wasn't alone. My body froze instantly. My hands stopped mid-motion, rinsing shampoo from my hair. The frosted glass door of the shower blurred everything beyond it into vague, shadowy shapes, but one thing was unmistakable, his silhouette. I knew it immediately. "Liam?" I whispered, a mix of surprise and confusion in my voice. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, shaky with shock and disbelief, as if his mind couldn't process what his eyes had just seen. In that moment, 1,000 thoughts exploded in my head, a disorienting blur. Why hadn't I locked the door? Why was he home so early? And, most importantly, what had he just witnessed? "Liam," I said sharply, my voice suddenly raw with urgency as I scrambled for the towel hanging just outside the shower. The glass fogged up as I yanked the door open, the rush of cool air hitting my skin like a slap. He stood there, frozen, his face pale, his eyes darting between the floor and the space just beyond me, not quite meeting mine. His expression was a mix of confusion, disbelief, and something else I couldn't quite place. "What are you doing in here?" I demanded, my voice trembling as I wrapped the towel tightly around myself. My heart raced, its rhythm erratic, but I couldn't tell if it was from anger, embarrassment, or something else entirely. The intensity of the moment left me reeling, unable to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions inside me. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out at first. He stood there, fumbling, as if his brain was struggling to find the right thing to say. Finally, he stammered, "I thought I heard your phone buzzing. I thought it might be important." His words tumbled out in a rush, defensive, almost like he was trying to convince both me and himself that his actions were justified. I couldn't help myself. "Your first thought was to barge into the bathroom?" I shot back, though my voice lacked the sharpness I'd intended. It came out softer, more uncertain than accusatory. "I didn't think. I wasn't," he faltered, the sentence unraveling before he could finish. His hands dug deep into the pockets of his sweatpants, and his shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of my words was pressing down on him. It was then that I saw it. The discomfort that had seemed like simple embarrassment was deeper, more complicated. There was something beneath it, something raw and unresolved. "It's fine," I said, my voice gentler now, softer. "Just, next time, knock, okay?" I tried to smooth things over, though inside I felt more unsettled than before. He nodded quickly, his eyes avoiding mine, looking anywhere but at me. "Yeah, sorry," he muttered, but there was something in his tone, something that made it sound like an apology he wasn't sure he meant, or maybe one he didn't know how to give. Neither of us moved, and the silence that followed felt heavy, clinging to the air like it didn't belong. He lifted his gaze for a brief second, almost imperceptibly, before turning and walking out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. As the sound of his footsteps faded, I stood there, clutching the towel to my body, my skin still damp. But it was my thoughts that were soaked in unease. In theory, the interaction should have been over, a simple mistake, a misstep that would be forgotten in time. But something about the way his eyes flickered, that brief moment where vulnerability had cracked through his usual demeanor, stayed with me. It lingered like an echo in my mind. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought, forcing myself to focus on the steady stream of water. But no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, I couldn't escape the feeling that the space between us, between a mother and her son, had subtly, almost imperceptibly, shifted. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine. Liam kept to himself, retreating to the solitude of his room, while I busied myself with chores around the house. But even as I moved from one task to the next, I couldn't shake the sensation of his presence hanging in the air like a quiet weight. It felt different now, heavier, as though something unspoken had shifted between us. I told myself it was nothing, just an awkward moment, an innocent misstep that would soon fade into the background of daily life. After all, we were both adults. It wasn't as if some deep, scandalous secret had been exposed. It was just a simple mistake. But the unease that lingered made it hard to believe that. And yet, despite my best efforts to move past it, each time I replayed the encounter in my mind, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was more than just awkward. It wasn't merely an innocent moment. There was something more to it, something in his eyes, something hesitant, almost unsure, and undeniably curious. That look stayed with me far longer than I could have expected, its weight pressing on me like an unspoken question I wasn't ready to answer. That evening, I found myself standing outside his bedroom door longer than I'd planned, a dinner tray in my hands. Normally, we ate together at the table, but tonight, he hadn't joined me. A strange quiet had settled over the house. I knocked softly on the door, hesitant to intrude but unsure of how else to approach him. "Liam, you okay?" I called out, trying to keep my tone light, like it was just a casual check-in. There was a pause before his voice reached me, muffled through the door but clear enough to understand. "Yeah, just not hungry," he replied, his words flat and distant. I hesitated for a moment, but then, against my better judgment, I opened the door. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his laptop open in front of him, though it was obvious he'd forgotten about it entirely. His posture was slumped, shoulders hunched forward in a way that made him look smaller, more withdrawn. When he finally glanced up at me, his expression was different. It wasn't the usual mask of indifference or irritation I'd come to expect from him, those signs of teenage frustration that had been so familiar for years. Instead, there was something else there, something I couldn't quite place. But it was undeniably off, out of the ordinary. "I brought you some food," I said, trying to break the tension as I set the tray down on the desk in front of him with a soft clink. "Thanks," he muttered, barely glancing at the tray before his eyes flicked back to the laptop screen. But it was clear his attention wasn't truly on it. No, his focus was elsewhere, on me, or maybe on the awkward space between us where 1,000 unspoken words seemed to hover in the air. "Liam, are we going to talk about this morning?" I asked, my voice gentle but firm as I leaned against the doorframe, folding my arms across my chest. It was a question that had been weighing on me all day, and it felt like the right moment to address it. For a brief second, he froze, his fingers lingering in midair above the keyboard, as though he was trying to gather his thoughts. Finally, he let out a sigh, but it was laced with a hint of something I couldn't quite name. "What's there to talk about?" he replied, his voice a little sharper than I expected, like he was trying to deflect. I sighed in return, letting a bit of frustration seep into my tone but keeping it measured. "I don't want things to be weird between us. It was an accident, and I don't want you to feel uncomfortable in your own house." "I'm not uncomfortable," he shot back quickly, almost too quickly, like he was trying to convince both me and himself. It was weird," he admitted, his voice faltering for just a moment. "Yeah, but I'm fine." "Really?" I said, my gaze still fixed on him. I studied him more closely then, taking in the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers fidgeted restlessly, tapping against his thigh in a rhythm I knew well enough to recognize as a nervous tick. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the morning that had unsettled him. There was something else, something deeper that he wasn't ready to confront. He wasn't fine, not completely, not yet. And for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it had the potential to change everything between us. "Look, I know things have been really tough lately," I began, my voice quiet as I took a few careful steps closer to him. "With the divorce, with me trying to rebuild my life and figure out who I am all over again, and now with everything that's been happening. I get it. It's a lot. But I want you to know you can talk to me about anything, no matter how big or small. I'm here. Always." For a brief moment, his eyes flickered up to meet mine. There was a subtle shift in the air, something almost tangible. It was as if the entire weight of the room changed. He wasn't looking at me as his mother, the person who had always been there, the one who had raised him, who had been his constant through everything, but as something else, someone separate, detached from the roles we'd always played. "I know," he said after a pause, his voice quieter, softer, almost hesitant now. I don't know. Everything's changing. You're different." I wasn't prepared for that. My breath caught in my chest. "Different how?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though a knot was forming in my stomach. He hesitated, his eyes searching for the right words, lips parted as if he wasn't sure how to put it. "I don't really know. It's just that you seem happier lately. Like, more alive, I guess." That took me off guard. My heart skipped a beat at his words, and I felt a strange warmth spread through me. He wasn't wrong. Despite everything, despite the pain, the loneliness that had often weighed heavily on my heart over the past months, there had been a certain kind of renewal, a shift that I wasn't sure how to explain but one that had definitely taken root. It was as if I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried for so long, parts of me that were more than just a mother, more than just the woman caught up in life's endless demands. I guess I'd been trying to focus on myself a little more, I said, almost unsure of the words myself but feeling the need to share them with him. I gave him a small, almost shy smile. Trying to figure out who I am again, beyond everything else. He nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on me, but there was something else in them now, a different kind of understanding, as if he was seeing me in a way he never had before. And the way that made me feel, it was complicated. It was confusing. And yet, there was something undeniably electric about it, something that I couldn't quite shake. It felt wrong in some ways, but at the same time, it was strangely freeing. "Good night, Liam," I said finally, backing toward the door. "Good night," he murmured, his eyes lingering on me as I left the room. The days that followed were a dance of stolen glances and unspoken words. At breakfast, I'd catch him watching me out of the corner of his eye, his gaze lingering on the curve of my neck as I poured coffee. When I walked past his room, I could feel his presence even through the closed door. I tried to push it away, to brush it off as nothing, but the truth was, I felt it too, a spark, an attention, a pull that I couldn't explain. One evening, after a particularly long day, I was in the living room, sipping a glass of wine and watching TV, the glow of the fireplace casting a warm light across the room. Liam came down, his hair tousled and his expression unreadable. "You look nice tonight," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I glanced at him, startled by the comment. I wasn't wearing anything special, just a loose sweater and leggings, but the way he said it made me feel like I was dressed in something far more daring. "Thanks," I said, my voice catching slightly. He sat down beside me, the space between us both too much and not enough. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire, and I could feel the heat of his body, the weight of his gaze. "Liam," I began, unsure where I was going with it, but when I turned to look at him, the words caught in my throat. He was looking at me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something that made my pulse race and my thoughts blur. Liam's gaze lingered on me, his expression unguarded in a way that made the room feel smaller, heavier. The warmth of the fire crackled softly behind me, but the heat I felt had nothing to do with the flames. My skin prickled under his eyes, and a slow, insistent pulse started in my chest. "What is it, Liam?" I asked, my voice soft, almost trembling. He hesitated, his lips parting as though he wanted to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he shifted closer, the cushions of the couch sinking slightly beneath his weight. The distance between us was shrinking, but neither of us made a move to stop it. "It's nothing," he finally murmured, but the look in his eyes betrayed him. It wasn't nothing. I should have said something, anything, to cut through the tension, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was acutely aware of everything, the faint scent of his cologne lingering on his clothes, the way his chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, the heat radiating from his body like an unspoken invitation. "You've been acting different," he said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "How so?" I managed, though my throat felt tight. He hesitated again, his eyes searching mine. "You just seem more confident, more beautiful." The word hung in the air between us, and I couldn't stop the way my heart leapt in response. It was wrong, I knew that, but hearing it, seeing the sincerity in his expression, stirred something deep inside me. "Liam," I began, but my voice faltered. "I mean it," he said quickly, his words tumbling out like a confession. "I've always thought you were beautiful, but lately, it's different. You're different." I felt my cheeks flush, the heat creeping down my neck and into my chest. "That's sweet of you to say, but I'm still your mom," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was pounding. "Are you?" His question caught me off guard, and I blinked at him, unsure of what he meant. "You're more than that, Mom. You're incredible. And sometimes I forget that you're not just," he trailed off, his frustration with his own words evident. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, I saw not the boy I'd raised but the man he had become. His jawline was sharper now, his shoulders broader, his features no longer softened by youth. It was a startling realization, and one that left me breathless. "Liam, we shouldn't, I know," he interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "I know we shouldn't, but I can't stop thinking about you." The weight of his words settled heavily between us, and I felt the air shift, charged with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I could feel my resolve slipping, fraying at the edges like a rope stretched too tight. Before I could stop myself, my hand reached out, brushing against his. The contact was electric, a spark that seemed to ignite something between us. He didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers curled around mine, his touch firm yet hesitant, as though he was afraid I might retreat. I should have pulled my hand back, stood up, and walked away. But I didn't. His thumb traced small circles against my skin, and the simple gesture sent a shiver up my spine. "Liam, tell me to stop," he said softly, his voice trembling but resolute. "If you want me to stop, just say the word." I opened my mouth, but the word wouldn't come. Instead, I felt myself leaning in, drawn to him by a force I couldn't name, couldn't fight. The distance between us disappeared in an instant. His lips brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But when I melted into the kiss instead of resisting, he deepened it, his hand coming up to cup my face. The kiss was slow, tender, yet filled with an intensity that made my head spin. His lips were soft, warm, and the taste of him, faintly minty with a hint of the coffee he'd had earlier, was intoxicating. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him as though I needed something to anchor me. His body was solid beneath my touch, his warmth seeping into me as the kiss grew more urgent, more desperate. "Liam," I whispered against his lips, but it wasn't a protest. It was a plea. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes dark with emotion. "I don't want this to be a mistake," he said, his voice rough with longing. "It already is," I replied, my breath hitching. "But I don't care." And I didn't. In that moment, nothing else mattered. No rules, no boundaries, no consequences. It was just us, caught in a moment that felt both forbidden and inevitable. He kissed me again, this time with more urgency, his hands tangling in my hair as he pulled me closer. My body responded instinctively, pressing against him as a soft moan escaped my lips. The fire crackled behind us, its warmth nothing compared to the heat between us. Time seemed to blur, and the world outside faded away until there was only him. His hands roamed slowly, reverently, as though he was discovering me for the first time. Every touch sent a jolt through me, awakening parts of myself I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel. His lips left mine and trailed down my jawline, feather-light yet searing. When his mouth found the sensitive spot just below my ear, a shiver ran down my spine, and I tilted my head back, giving him unspoken permission to continue. "Liam," his name slipped from my lips like a whisper, my voice trembling with both anticipation and disbelief. He pulled back just enough to meet my gaze, his hands resting on either side of my face. His eyes searched mine, dark and filled with a mix of longing and uncertainty. "Do you want me to stop?" I should have said yes. I should have pushed him away, told him this was wrong, that it could never happen again. But instead, I found myself shaking, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "No," I whispered, the word escaping before I could stop it. The moment I said it, something shifted between us. The hesitation melted away, replaced by an unspoken understanding that we had crossed a line we could never uncross. And yet, neither of us cared. He kissed me again, deeper this time, his hands sliding down to my waist and pulling me closer. My body fit against his as though we had been made for this moment, and the heat between us was undeniable, inescapable. The soft fabric of my sweater bunched beneath his fingers as he gripped me, his touch firm yet gentle. I felt his breath against my neck, warm and unsteady, as he whispered, "You're so beautiful." The words made my chest tighten, and I let out a shaky breath, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. His hands slipped under the hem of my sweater, his fingertips grazing my skin, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. I gasped softly, my fingers tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. His touch was both tentative and assured, as though he was savoring every second, every inch of me. "Liam, we shouldn't," I murmured, but my voice lacked conviction. He paused, his hands stilling against my skin. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked again, his voice low and thick with emotion. I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of my own conflicting feelings. There was no turning back now, no undoing what had already happened. And in that moment, I didn't want to. "No," I said again, my voice steady this time. His lips curved into a soft, almost relieved smile, and he kissed me once more. His hands slid further up my sides, exploring the curve of my waist. The sensation was overwhelming, every nerve ending in my body coming alive under his touch. I felt myself being lowered gently onto the couch, the world tilting as I sank into the cushions. His body hovered over mine, his weight pressing down just enough to make me feel anchored, safe. The firelight cast flickering shadows across his face, illuminating the sharp angles of his jaw and the intense determination in his eyes. He looked at me as though I was the only thing that mattered, and in that moment, I believed it. His hands found their way to the hem of my leggings, his fingers pausing as though seeking my permission. I nodded, my breath catching as he slowly peeled them away. His touch was deliberate and careful, as though he was unwrapping a precious gift. The cool air against my skin was a stark contrast to the heat radiating from him, and I couldn't help the soft sigh that escaped my lips as his hands traced the length of my thighs. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, reaching up to cup his face. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm more than okay." His lips captured mine again, and the rest of the world faded away. There was only us, tangled together in a moment that felt both forbidden and inevitable, like we had been moving toward this from the very beginning. As the night deepened and the fire crackled softly in the background, we surrendered to the pull between us, letting it consume us completely. The warmth of his skin was intoxicating, and as the night stretched on, time seemed to dissolve around us. His touch grew bolder, each movement of his hands igniting a fire that refused to be tamed. My senses were on high alert, every nerve alive with anticipation. Liam's lips trailed down my neck, leaving a path of heat that made me shiver. I closed my eyes, my fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as though it were the only thing keeping me grounded. The scent of him, clean and faintly woodsy, filled the space between us, mingling with the lingering smoke from the fire. "You're amazing," he murmured, his voice rough and filled with awe. The way he said it, as though he truly meant it, made my chest tighten. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at me the way he did, like I was the most important thing in the world. I let out a shaky breath as his hands explored me. His touch was reverent yet filled with a quiet confidence that sent waves of pleasure coursing through me. My body arched instinctively beneath his, responding to him in ways I couldn't control. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the intensity in his eyes as he looked down at me. His gaze wasn't just hungry, it was filled with something deeper, something that made my heart ache in a way I couldn't explain. "You're sure?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my hand reaching up to brush against his cheek. "Yes," I said softly, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotion swirling inside me. With that, the last of our restraint melted away. Our movements became more urgent, more desperate, as though we were trying to make up for all the time we had spent holding back. His kisses were searing, his touch relentless, and I gave myself over to him completely, losing myself in the storm we had unleashed. The hours passed in a blur of tangled limbs and whispered confessions, the world outside forgotten as we explored the depths of each other. It was only when the fire had died down to embers and the first hints of dawn began to seep through the curtains that we finally slowed, our breaths mingling in the quiet aftermath. Liam lay beside me on the couch, his arm draped protectively over my waist. His chest rose and fell steadily, and I could feel the warmth of his breath against my shoulder. The room was silent except for the faint creak of the house settling and the distant chirping of birds outside. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The weight of what had happened hung between us, but it wasn't oppressive. It was a quiet understanding, a fragile connection that we were both afraid to break. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the room in soft gold, I turned to look at him. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. He looked younger somehow, vulnerable, and the sight stirred something deep within me. I reached out, my fingers tracing the curve of his jaw, the softness of his lips. His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he just looked at me, his gaze filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "Good morning," he said, his voice husky with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, my lips curving into a small smile. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead, and I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the sunlight streaming in. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, my fingers brushing against his chest. "I am," I said honestly. "Are you?" He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up his face. "I am," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. For a while, we simply lay there, the morning stretching out before us like an unspoken promise. But as the reality of the day began to settle in, so did the weight of what had happened. "Liam," I said softly, my voice tinged with hesitation. "Yeah? We need to talk about this," I said, my fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on his chest. "About what this means." He nodded, his expression growing serious. I know. I don't regret it, he said, his voice firm. Neither do I admitted, the word surprising even myself. His hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine as he looked at me. Then we'll figure it out. I wanted to believe him, to believe that we could navigate this uncharted territory without falling apart. But for now, in the quiet intimacy of the morning, I allowed myself to simply be present. I held on to the fleeting sense of peace that wrapped around us like a cocoon. The day ahead would bring questions and challenges, but for now, there was only us. And that was enough. The warmth of the morning sun crept higher into the room, but the space between us felt frozen in time. Liam's hand brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though testing whether this fragile moment could hold. When I didn't pull away, he laced his fingers with mine. The gesture was both tender and grounding. Last night, his voice broke the silence, low and unsteady. It was everything. I finished for him, my heart thumping in my chest. The words had slipped out before I could stop them, but I didn't regret it. It was the truth. His lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes remained serious, flickering with emotions too complex to name. It doesn't have to be just once, he said softly, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. It doesn't have to end here. My breath hitched, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket, warm and suffocating all at once. Liam, we can't, I began, but even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. Why not? He pressed, his voice growing more confident. He leaned closer, his hand moving to cup my face. I know what this looks like. I know what people would think. But last night felt real. It felt right. His words sent a shiver through me, and I closed my eyes as his thumb traced the curve of my cheek. It's not that simple, I murmured, my voice trembling. Maybe it is, he countered. His lips brushed against my temple, the intimacy of the gesture making my resolve falter. I turned my head just enough for our eyes to meet. Liam, tell me you didn't feel it, he said, his voice soft but insistent. Tell me you didn't want it as much as I did. I opened my mouth to argue, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. I had felt it. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word had awakened something inside me that I hadn't known was still there. He leaned in, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was slow and deliberate, as though he was giving me time to change my mind. But I didn't. I couldn't. My body betrayed me, responding to him with a hunger that matched his own. The kiss deepened, and suddenly, everything else faded away. There was no sunlight streaming through the curtains, no weight of the world pressing down on us. There was only him, his warmth, his touch, the way his hands slid down to my waist, pulling me closer as though he couldn't bear the distance between us. Liam, wait, I gasped, breaking the kiss. What's wrong? He asked, his brow furrowing in concern. I shook my head, trying to gather my scattered thoughts. We need to think about this. About what this means for us. For everything. He exhaled sharply, his frustration evident, but he nodded. I know. I get it. But I don't regret it. I won't regret it. The way he said it, so sure, so unwavering, sent a pang of both longing and fear through me. Neither will I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But we can't just pretend this didn't happen. I don't want to pretend, he said firmly, his hands cupping my face, his gaze locked onto mine. I want more. I want you. The intensity in his eyes was overwhelming, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt the weight of his words, the raw sincerity behind them, and I knew we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. But before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. My heart leapt into my throat, and I bolted upright, my pulse racing. Liam, someone's here, I said, panic lacing my voice. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. Who could it be? I didn't have time to answer. The sound of a car door slamming was followed by the unmistakable voice of my ex-husband calling out from the front porch. Laura, are you home? My blood ran cold. Liam's eyes widened in realization, and he moved to stand, his body tense and alert. Why is he here? He asked. I don't know, I whispered, my mind racing. But you need to go upstairs. Now. He hesitated, his jaw clenching as though he wanted to argue, but the urgency in my voice finally spurred him into action. He grabbed his shirt from the floor and disappeared up the stairs just as the front door swung open. I turned to face my ex, my heart pounding as I tried to steady my breathing. The weight of the night still lingered on my skin, a secret that felt too big to keep but too dangerous to reveal. Laura, he said, stepping into the room and giving me a cursory glance. We need to talk. I forced a tight smile, my mind still spinning. About what? But even as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to unravel. Narrator's comment. You ever have one of those moments where you know your life's about to change, but you're not sure if it's for better or worse? That's where I was at. Standing there, trying to act normal while my whole world felt like it was teetering on the edge. Funny how one knock on the door can change everything. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you haven't yet subscribed, I invite you to press the subscribe button. Your support, even if it seems like a small gesture, means a lot to us and drives us to continue creating content with heart. Don't forget to give it a like if you enjoyed what we shared today. Every interaction helps us grow and allows us to keep connecting with you through stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this community.